Well, welcome on this rainy/snowy day to the Harold Bealey Library Auditorium. We're very pleased on behalf of the David M. Kennedy Center for International Studies to welcome back to campus Michael J. Gerson, who's a senior advisor with One and a Washington Post columnist. Presentation topic for today is Nature Out to Kill Us, America's Response to the Global Health Crisis. Today's lecture will be recorded, and we're glad that you're joining us here today. A couple of quick announcements as the semester comes to a close. There's a very exciting opportunity tomorrow, the 9th of April at 11 a.m. Congo moving forward. There will be a report on progress and activities in the Democratic Republic of the Congo presented by 3 visiting members of the Quorum of the 70 of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Elder Jean-Pierre Lono, Elder Alfred Kyungu, and Elder Jean-Claude Mabaya will be visiting and will be speaking as part of the History 261 Modern Africa class and, of course, our African Studies minor program. That will be in the JFSB B103. So I'll say that again. Tomorrow at 11 a.m. in the JFSB room B103 at 11 o'clock. Also, tomorrow at 10 o'clock and at noon, we will be hosting Kazuo Takamatsu, who's a former member of the Japanese Diet. He'll be speaking on current issues in Japanese politics. And pay close attention to this. The 10 o'clock presentation in the Kennedy Center will be in Japanese, no translation. The noon presentation will be in 745 Swicket with translation for the rest of us. So again, that's tomorrow at 10 o'clock in Japanese and at noon in English. The last event, which is the flyer you see here, and there are copies of these flyers as you enter and leave today, is our next and our last of the semester Kennedy Tech event. If you haven't been to one of these events, it's a great opportunity to get off campus, explore career options in an area of which many liberal arts students may not initially think about. We've come across a wide range of liberal arts graduates who've done interesting things in technology, and many of them have reached out to us and agreed to help us bring in speakers, people who have essentially reached the CEO founder level with their companies, but who had a liberal arts background, not a computer science or not an engineering background. We're pleased to welcome Mark Chen, who's the CEO and founder of SaltStack. I have a hard time explaining what they do, but it has to do with cloud server automation. But what's most important is he'll talk a little bit about how someone with a liberal arts background has made it in the technology world. He spent some time working on Wall Street and also working in Hong Kong, where he is from originally. He's a Kennedy Center graduate, BYU MBA graduate. We have a free ride, so the BYU bus, the ride, will pick you up at 5:30 at the Museum of Art and take you down to the Startup Building. If you haven't been down there, that's where the food truck roundup happens. There'll be some food trucks there. It'll be a lot of fun. So it'll be a nice way to kind of wrap up your semester and network and explore career opportunities in what's quickly becoming kind of an interesting technology scene in Provo. We'll foreclose our presentations or the announcements today, but please follow us on Facebook. You can follow this lecture and others on Twitter using the hashtag KennedyLive. And we hope that if you're taking off on an international program for the summer, hope to see you back in the fall. For those who are around, follow us online because there will be various events and activities that will be continuing just on a less frequent basis. Well, we'd like to begin today, as is our custom, with an opening prayer. We've invited Katie Smith, who's a political science major from Salt Lake City, Utah, to offer that prayer, and then I will introduce today's speaker. Katie?
Our dear kind, gracious Father in heaven, we're grateful for this day that Thou hast given unto us and for this opportunity that we have to learn more about this world that we live in and how we can become better stewards unto Thee and to Thy children here. We're grateful, Father, for the speaker that is here, and please bless him that he will be able to share what he needs to this day to further our knowledge and to help us to develop a better love for our fellow mankind here and to know what we can do. We love Thee, Father, and this is our prayer that we leave in the name of Thy Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Well, first of all, let me just mention today's lecture is made possible thanks to our friends from One. In case you didn't get a chance to meet Jennifer, who's here from One, here at the back of the room, she'll be here on your way out at a table. You can stop and find out more information. So One's a nonpartisan global campaign and advocacy organization. They have over 3 million members. They are involved worldwide in fighting for smart and sufficient resources, deployed in accountable ways that combat extreme poverty, hunger, and preventable disease, and work to help the world's poorest, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, to live in dignity. It's a great organization. We welcome them back to campus. We've had a notable BYU alum of ours who's been working with One, and we're just thrilled to have them here today and grateful for their willingness to come back and also to share with us Michael Gerson. Michael Gerson writes about politics, global health and development, religion, and foreign policy in a bi-weekly column in the Washington Post. If you're not following it, you should jump on and do that right now. And he's also in nearly 100 other newspapers. He's the co-author of City of Man, Religion and Politics in a New Era, and author of Heroic Conservatism, Why Republicans Need to Embrace America's Ideals and Why They Deserve to Fail If They Don't. He serves on the Initiative for Global Development Leadership Council and on the boards of the U.S. Center for Global Leadership and the News Literacy Project, as well as the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics. He's currently the 2015 Pamela and Jack Egan Visiting Professor at Duke University. Until 2006, he was a top aide to President George W. Bush as Assistant to the President for Policy and Strategic Planning. Prior to that appointment, he had served in the White House in several roles, including as Deputy Assistant to the President and Director of Presidential Speechwriting, having joined Bush's campaign as a policy advisor and chief speechwriter in early 1999. Previous to that, he was a senior editor covering politics at U.S. News and World Report. You've probably seen him regularly in media. He appears on the PBS NewsHour, Face the Nation, and other programs. He received his degree in theology from Wheaton College in Illinois. His presentation today, as I mentioned, is Nature Out to Kill Us, America's Response to the Global Health Crisis. Please join me in welcoming back to BYU, Michael Gerson.
Thank you so much. It really is a pleasure to be back at BYU and at the Kennedy Center on behalf of the One campaign. Let me start with a little bit of an apology. I'm on some pain meds that are otherwise rather pleasant, but I leave a dry mouth. So forgive me if I seem a little bit thirsty today, but who knows what will happen with a speaker on tramadol. First, I want to thank all of you for taking the time to attend a speech on pandemic disease, including HIV/AIDS. I know that a lecture on a venereal disease is not every college student's idea of a good time. This is something you could also probably get at the Student Health Center. But this is an extraordinary time to be thinking about infectious disease. In the last 10 to 15 years, I have witnessed one of the greatest health policy successes in history, an AIDS response that is holding back a wave of death across a continent. We've also seen a virus that originated on the Guinea border, perhaps in a certain tree filled with infected bats that caused a global health emergency. It has never been more obvious how connected human beings are in this world, in their hopes, in their suffering, and in their vulnerability. In Ebola, we got a glimpse of a future we can't accept. Bill Gates recently wrote an article in the New England Journal of Medicine that said, of all the things that could kill more than 10 million people around the world, the most likely is an epidemic stemming from either natural causes or bioterrorism. In that article, which all of you should read if you have any interest in this topic, he paints a vivid picture. The emergence of an infectious virus that would spawn global panic, overwhelm the supply of medical commodities, set off a desperate technological race against death, reduce global wealth by trillions of dollars, and fill millions of graves. So these are the visions before us. A vision of mass action and hope and health, and a vision of mass panic and death, which is predictable and in all likelihood preventable. There are few other issues where the human stakes, the moral stakes, are quite as high as this one. That's a lot to swallow right before lunch. I will address all of these topics today. Let me start by just telling you a very little bit about myself. I graduated from a school that was similar in some ways to the one that you attend, Wheaton College, just outside Chicago. As some of you may know, it's a very religiously conservative place. When I went there, there was a joke on campus that said the administration had banned premarital sex because it might lead to dancing. I spent some time as a staffer in the U.S. Senate. I worked as a very junior speechwriter for Bob Dole in 1996. After Dole, I went to spend some time in the media as a reporter. Then in the spring of 1999, I got a call from then Governor George W. Bush of Texas, who wanted to meet me at a hotel in Washington. The first thing he said to me was, "This isn't an interview. I've read your stuff. I want you to write my announcement speech, my convention speech, and my inaugural address. And I want you to move to Austin immediately." At that point, he was not even a declared candidate, but his confidence was infectious. And so I loaded up my family in the car and went. From the start, we were a little bit of an odd couple. He is outgoing, athletic, likable, and I'm actually none of those things. He has a penchant for locker room humor that makes me uncomfortable. I remember after one policy session at the governor's mansion in Austin, everyone had gone but me, and the governor had some time before his next appointment. He asked me, "Do you want to hang out a little while?" With a rudeness that now seems crazed, I replied, "Not really," which is not the way to treat a future president. But I came to respect Bush as a politician and as a person. He is casual and funny and authentic and kind and loyal to the people around him. And he can occasionally be sharp-tongued. Every year on the day of the State of the Union address, the president sits down with all the network anchors for a time of question and answer. At one of those sessions, I remember the late Peter Jennings asked him, "What does it feel like to go before the nation and read someone else's words?" The president immediately replied, "You do it every night." The pace of those years, including 9/11, the Afghan campaign, the Iraq War, Katrina, was at times exhausting, has a cost to your health, cost to your family. During the heat of the presidential election of 2004, my youngest son, Nicholas, then 6 years old, announced to me in the car that he wanted John Kerry for president. When I asked him why, he said, "So you can be home on weekends." My 9-year-old, who was a little more practical, then said, "But how would we eat?" I told him I think I could get a job, I might go to a think tank, and he said, "Of course, what's a think tank?" And so I told him, well, it's people who read and speak and have meetings and things. And Bucky, and this is true, said, "You mean they don't do anything?" After the 2004 election, my job at the White House changed. I became a policy advisor focused on global health, development, and genocide, areas where my interests had been leading me for many years. And I saw something very hopeful. In one of the bitterest times of partisanship in modern history, I also found a number of issues where members of both parties and people of every ideology have come together. As part of my job at the White House, I worked with conservative and liberal groups on global AIDS and malaria and global sex trafficking and the effort to confront the crisis in Darfur. I've seen some odd alliances grow. I've gotten to know Bono of the rock band U2 a little bit over the years. Several years ago, he invited me to the first rock concert I had ever attended, and it was loud. Soon afterwards, my wife and I had dinner with Bono, who was a very idealistic and principled man. After dinner, I remember my wife told me, "You may be idealistic and principled, but it would also be nice if you were rich and cool." Now I'm a columnist for the Washington Post, writing twice a week. I'm a fellow at the One campaign, which is represented by Jen at the table outside. One was one of our main outside partners on our global health efforts. Meticulously bipartisan organization, including people from across the spectrum, and I'll have a little more to say about that later. The title of my talk is Nature Out to Kill Us, which might sound hysterical unless you lived in some place like Liberia or Sierra Leone or Guinea. And it is part of a historical pattern of struggle between humans and microbes in which humans have often suffered massive casualties. The Black Plague may have killed 2/3 of Europe's population over a 4-year period from 1347 to 1351. The Spanish flu of 1918 infected about 1/3 of the entire world and caused 50 million deaths. An elevated temperature in the morning could mean death by dinner time. All these vast numbers in these outbreaks are comprised of individuals. It was likely a 2-year-old boy from Guinea who died just before Christmas 2 years ago, who was patient 0 in the Ebola outbreak, leading in 8 months to the WHO, the World Health Organization, declaring an international health emergency. I was introduced to the global AIDS crisis in the 1990s when my college roommate, Jordan, died of AIDS. He was class president, and he knew the name of everyone on campus, and I watched his life fade painfully away only a few years before the development of miracle drugs that could have saved him. Jordan died in 1994 at the age of 30. Many in my generation had this experience of losing friends to AIDS, an experience that many students today will never have. When I entered the White House about 7 or 8 years after Jordan's death, the global AIDS crisis was reaching its worst. Of about 30 million people with HIV in sub-Saharan Africa, perhaps 50,000 were on treatment. The pandemic had already produced 14 million orphans. Walking through South African shantytowns, I mainly met grandparents and their grandchildren. The intervening generation was nearly erased. Millions were dying at the same time, and yet in total isolation, surrounded by the barbed wire of stigma. In the worst affected countries, life expectancy had fallen by 20 years. I remember speaking to an American physician in Zambia who had begun doing small-scale treatment in the year 2000. When he moved to Lusaka, his daughter attended an English language school across town. Each day, he would have to leave an hour early to navigate large traffic jams caused by the constant funeral processions that went on all day, every day, in the capital of Zambia. As a government official, I remember going to Namibia, to a hospital in Windhoek, and meeting a mother, father, and young child who were all HIV positive. The woman had named her child in the local language, "There is no good in the world." It's hard for me to imagine the despair and anguish that would cause a mother to name her child, "There is no good in the world," and it must have seemed true. But I also remember a particular policy meeting at the White House, perhaps my best experience in government. I sat in the Oval Office and watched the President of the United States embrace the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR, the largest initiative to fight a single disease in human history. Many factors went into that decision. The cost of ARV treatments, the antiretroviral treatments, were quickly coming down from $15,000 a year to about $300 a year for generics. There were effective outside advocates like Bono. But ultimately, a decision is made by a leader in a meeting in a room with coffee cups around a table. In the meeting where PEPFAR was discussed, there were a lot of questions about treatment. Was it worth the considerable cost? Was it practical? At one point, National Security Advisor Condi Rice spoke up and talked of her mother, who was diagnosed with cancer when Condi was a teenager, but lived on cancer treatment until Condi was an adult. She said in that meeting, "You bet those years meant something to me, and they would mean something to every African child whose mother lives to take care of them." Today, more than 9 million people are on AIDS treatment in sub-Saharan Africa, thanks to PEPFAR, the Global Fund, and the glowing contributions of countries themselves. These are some of the largest, broadest gains in the history of public health, actions by America in the great tradition of the Marshall Plan and the Peace Corps. Much of a generation has lived to care for their children because the U.S. cared and acted. And that family I visited in Namibia were some of the first to receive treatment under PEPFAR, and the little girl with the hopeless name was running and playing around my legs. For over a decade, I've spent a significant amount of time in Africa, as a government official, as a writer, and as an activist. It's an odd way to travel, visiting beautiful countries and spending most of my time in health clinics, AIDS testing centers, and malaria wards. These are generally not on the tour. But my most vivid visit came recently at a hospital in rural Rwanda at the end of a windy road to nowhere. While touring the ward where AIDS patients with opportunistic infections are treated, I was told that there were no cases that day. Thinking there was a miscommunication, I asked again, but there were no cases. In that area, AIDS treatment is essentially universal. The hospital is focusing on low birth weight babies and people with diabetes and heart disease, not infectious threats. It is the most hopeful thing I've seen on one of my trips. Empty beds, empty AIDS wards, the evidence of an emergency defeated, the victory of health and normality and life, the possibility of good in the world. This is, of course, not true everywhere, especially in conflict zones and among particularly vulnerable and forgotten groups. But in many places I visit, vast health emergencies have become more manageable. And there's a palpable sense of promise and optimism. Economies are growing, trade is expanding, middle-class expectations are increasing. The main story of our time, with some obvious exceptions, is not Africa needing, but Africa rising. And for those of you interested in AIDS policy, this is an extraordinary moment. The end of mother-to-child transmission is now a serious prospect. And over the last few years, the science of prevention has been transformed with dramatic results from male circumcision, microbicides, and early treatment, which lowers transmission rates. When these methods are combined, along with condom use, and aggressively applied in the most vulnerable regions and groups, transmission rates would decline an additional 40 to 60%. This raises a prospect comparable to medical achievements such as the eradication of smallpox or advances in cancer treatment. Currently, for every new AIDS patient put on treatment, about 2 more become infected. Millions of lives are saved, but we still lose ground to the disease. With combination prevention, the balance would shift. For every person who begins treatment, there would be fewer than one who becomes infected. This would be the beginning of the end of AIDS, something your generation could hope to achieve. When I stood in that empty AIDS ward in Rwanda, where there were AIDS hospices 10 or 12 years ago, I thought of the great chain of conscience that made it possible, a chain connecting the Oval Office and members of Congress from both parties who've supported AIDS programs, and health officials in America and Africa, and activists across the country who gave the most vulnerable people in the world a voice in our politics. Nature may be out to kill us, but it is possible for humanity to fight back with victories measured in millions of lives. This kind of determination was recently tested again on Ebola, a very different threat. The HIV virus is insidious because it can hide in the body for a decade, constantly shifting its shell of sugars to avoid detection. It spreads silently and kills slowly, which is why 35 million people have the virus in their bodies today, including 1.1 million in the United States. 1 out of 6 Americans who is HIV positive doesn't know it, meaning they can be unknowingly passing the virus along. And the highest levels of new infections are among people aged 20 to 24, which are all good reasons to know your status. Ebola, in contrast, kills swiftly and horribly, creating panic and suspicion. It takes up to 3 weeks to incubate, usually around 10 days. It passes through bodily fluids, blood, urine, feces. It causes fever, organ failure, internal bleeding, septic shock. There have been outbreaks before, most notably in Uganda a few years ago, but it was contained with the normal countermeasures for an infectious disease: isolation, contact tracing. One reason this was possible in Uganda was because PEPFAR had helped strengthen local health systems. And this is the reason that the risk of a broad AIDS outbreak in the United States was never very high. A competent health system can deal with this threat. But those systems, of course, do not exist in parts of West Africa. Decades of civil war and economic mismanagement have destroyed nearly all working infrastructure and institutions in Liberia. For 15 years, following 1991, for example, there was no electricity in the entire country except from private generators. When my son and I visited Liberia and met with President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf 3 years ago, there were still only 5,800 households in the entire country on the electrical grid. Before the current outbreak, there was one doctor for every 100,000 people. So the deadliest virus in the world struck the most vulnerable countries in the world. And the virus spreads tragically through caregiving to doctors and nurses, to caring relatives, to people who ritually and respectfully wash the corpses of family members for burial. This is the particular cruelty of this disease. It forbids and punishes the deepest human instincts to care. Last year, I began to hear panic in the voices of American infectious disease experts I talk to frequently, who are normally very calm and clinical in their approach. Ebola had entered urban settings, which had never happened before. The upward curve of new infections was becoming exponential. Groups were doing good work on the ground, but there was no command and control, no logistical support, shortages of gloves and soap and buckets. The global response was arguably too slow, but the tide has genuinely turned. Local leaders, including President Sirleaf, have provided an effective prevention message, particularly the measures that prevent infections within families. It's been a message carried by community health workers. Burial teams became better educated and trained and more trusted by families to take bodies. As the infection rate began to fall, the intensity of fear lessened, and people began to listen to the authorities. In addition, the presence of U.S.-built Ebola treatment units eliminated the horrific scenes of bodies lying in the streets and sick people being turned away because no beds were available. As ETUs became more available, people would bring their sick family members into the units before they would infect others. This has been a true success, due to mainly to the resistance and resilience of the people of West Africa and to the care taken by other countries to prevent the spread of Ebola, countries like Nigeria and Senegal and Mali. It has been especially inspiring, I think, to see people who have recovered from the disease and worked to help other Ebola patients because they were immune. But the destruction has been terrible. Many survivors are traumatized from watching family members die one by one. When they return home, all their possessions have often been destroyed as a precaution. Some have been evicted from their homes. Many suffer terrible stigma and discrimination. In some cases, merchants refuse to sell food to recovered Ebola patients. And the health sector has been hit very hard. By one estimate, nearly 200 Liberian health professionals died on the front lines of the Ebola fight. Malaria control efforts have been set back by a decade. In Sierra Leone, ARV distribution was reduced by 30%. Efforts to prevent mother-to-child transmission were down by 90%. On Ebola, It is still too early to let up pressure, but it is not too early to draw some lessons. We know one thing with complete certainty. The world is utterly unprepared for an outbreak 100 times as large. The first and foundational layer of pandemic preparedness is the disease surveillance system in developing countries. I was just in Tanzania at its national laboratory, which is trying to be certified to handle Ebola, to become a biosafety level 3 facility, which would cut off days from the current practice of sending samples of pathogens to Nairobi. Many developing countries lack even the minimal capacity to identify outbreaks before they become epidemics. Ebola has been an excellent argument to address disparities in health infrastructure across the world. A second layer of preparedness is emergency response. Let me put it this way. When the bat signal is put up in the sky, who will answer? The emergency response system was not weak in responding to Ebola. That system was non-existent. Recently, I talked with the former White House Ebola czar, Ron Klain. He told me, quote, "From the movies, you'd think there was some rapid response force of 5,000 guys in yellow biohazard suits ready to deploy. It is not true." Emergency response, the ability to provide on a moment's notice logistics and command and control in the midst of chaos, is a very rare global commodity. It is currently possessed by the United States military, NATO, and pretty much no one else. In the end, it was the 101st Airborne that responded in Liberia. But the US military would not be so welcome everywhere, say in Karachi, Pakistan. The UN and World Health Organization will not have this capability anytime soon. Only the G8 nations seem to have the ability and wealth. It is now, before a pandemic strikes, that they need to show some foresight and determination as well. I'll just briefly add the third layer of preparedness, an unclogged research and development pipeline to stay ahead of mutations that make diseases more deadly, easier to transmit, or more resistant to treatment. It was because of a surge in research after the 9/11 threat that the NIH had the vector, a harmless chimp virus, that was the basis for their Ebola vaccine. Research funding is the only way to stay ahead of the microbes in a deadly race. So now that I've thoroughly scared you, what does this mean for all of us? To those who don't sit in the Oval Office, or in my case would no longer be welcome there, what difference can we possibly make? Let me start by saying that professionals related to community and global health are some of the most important in the world. The people who do the research and detection and vaccination and treatment and prevention. They often stand between society and disaster. The most impressive people I ever met in government were not economists, not politicians or lawyers. They were the great humanitarian researchers and physicians, Tony Fauci, Francis Collins, Mark Dybul. These names may not be familiar, but they will be remembered for programs and breakthroughs that have saved millions of lives. And if you have any talent in this field, it is worth your effort and ambition. Most of us, of course, can't do that work either, but all of us can be advocates for people who do. We can give to organizations such as Doctors Without Borders, Samaritan's Purse, Catholic Relief Services, and LDS Charities. And we can give a voice to the vulnerable in our political system, since American leadership has been essential to all of these efforts. This is the theory of the One campaign. When I was in government, as I mentioned, One was our main outside partner in urging members of Congress to fund effort on AIDS, malaria, and development more broadly. Today, One is the main grassroots organization in America, pushing for efforts on Ebola, childhood vaccination, clean electrical production, as well as continuing the fight against AIDS until it is won. BYU, by the way, needs a One chapter, and I really hope someone will step forward to be campus leader. The world does not lack for great causes. It only lacks for people who will make those causes their own. And I believe that the cause of ending extreme poverty and preventable disease is worth all the time and study and idealism that you can provide. So visit the One Table with Jen after the event, and she'll be able to answer your questions. This is something that unites right and left. It is a refuge from the bitterness of American politics. It calls forth the best of America, and I've seen what can be accomplished. The mothers who live to take care of their children, the children who are living to drive the rise of their nations, not a lost generation, but a found generation, busy with life and work and hope. And I have found something else. In trying to help someone, you discover that they have more to offer you than you can possibly give. So let me close with one story from my time in government. Several years ago now, I was in Kampala, Uganda, in a refugee community on the side of a steep hill. 90% of the residents were women or children, refugees from up north, where a brutal rebel group called the Lord's Resistance Army killed large numbers of the men. Most of the women were HIV positive and had terrible stories of suffering. Some of the boys had been kidnapped by the LRA and trained as soldiers, forced, I was told, to do terrible things, such as murdering family members and neighbors in their home village so they could never return. One of the former child soldiers I met was maybe 16 or 17 years old. When the leader of the LRA, Joseph Kony, visited his prisoners, all were forced to prostrate themselves. But this man looked up in curiosity, and they took out one of his eyes in punishment. At the center of the settlement is a steep-walled, open-pit mine. Brush is pushed against the walls and set on fire to remove water from the rock and cause it to crumble, leaving a permanent haze in the air. The women of the village support themselves by getting rocks out of the pit and breaking them into gravel with small metal hammers. Each has her own pile that she adds to for several hours a day. After Hurricane Katrina on America's Gulf Coast, these women, most of them HIV positive, somehow collected a few $100s and sent it to the American Embassy to help with relief efforts. When I thank them on behalf of our government, I have never seen a group of people more proud of themselves. I was told by one woman, "We are the donors now." The generosity of the poor turns out to be more impressive than anything we give them. We should be honored to take their side and humble enough to learn from them. So now I'm happy to take some questions on this or any other topic, if you want to. It is a long one.
It is. Come down because we're recording. Tell us your name and what you're studying. We have a few minutes for some questions, please. And feel free to queue up behind if we're ready for your question.
So I'm Stephen Florence. I'm studying PD Bio, but I'm here for my political science class. So kind of those two merge into my question. You talked about how essential research funding and research is going to be in combating new diseases over the next little while. But I was curious how prepared and how willing different nations are to share that research in those different areas. You mentioned a big portion came out of 9/11, and that would suggest to me that it's anti-terrorism or whatever. So how willing are they to share on that?
I'm afraid to say that the U.S. effort on research and development as it relates to disease dwarfs every other country. I'm proud of that, but you would prefer to see a more equal distribution of those burdens, particularly with Europeans, it seems to me. The European pharmaceutical industry, of course, is very active, but what we're talking about is really the fundamental science that's often used by pharmaceutical companies to apply. The United States did something absolutely remarkable under Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. During that period, the late Clinton years and the 8 years of the Bush presidency, the federal government doubled the funding for NIH, the National Institutes of Health, which is one of the best, most effective honorable institutions in the American government. So that, I think, was a massive investment that, by the way, we've seen significant results and benefits from. The methods by which we do burden sharing, we do very little burden sharing in the research and development area that I'm aware of. We do a significant amount when it comes to treatment and other global health efforts through the Global Fund for AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis, by which the U.S. actually, I think, does about 1/3 of that fund, and then it's matched 2/3 by other countries. That's the pattern. We also give to international organizations like Gavi. Very few people know what Gavi is, but it's the Global Vaccine Alliance, which was created with help from the Gates Foundation. They pay a significant amount they fund that in a significant way. So that's actually a sharing between public and private. And a lot of other countries pay into Gavi. It's one of the main programs that the UK funds. So there are a variety of burden sharing mechanisms when it comes to global health, but the US really is far and away the main actor when it comes to research and development.
Thank you so much for coming. Your presentation was thrilling, and we're very grateful you could be here. I'm Natalie Lemire, Teaching International Development.
Mm-hmm.
My question for you is, what advice can you give our international development and public health students who are neither pre-nursing nor pre-med, but they would love to get involved? What type of career should they look into, and what type of skill sets should they look into developing right now? Could you repeat the question?
Yes, of course. Yeah, I'm happy to. The question is what students who are studying in a variety of fields, international relations, but also the non-medical fields, essentially, what career paths that they might take. Obviously, I'm not necessarily the expert because I was a theology major in college. I went at this thing through writing. I was really very much a domestic policy person, and had a shift in focus when I was in government, particularly as we began to focus on development and as kind of an element of our national security policy. There are a couple of items of advice that I would have. The first one is, I think government service is an extraordinary way to contribute. It is an amazingly purposeful career choice. That's true of the people I know in USAID who implement many of these programs, PEPFAR, the President's Malaria Initiative, involved in those programs and do exceptional work. It was one of the best things about these large initiatives over the last 10 or 15 years is that it gave people that were working for years in this field the resources to make a real difference. I remember being in South Africa, meeting with someone from USAID who had done global health for a decade on the ground in South Africa, who was involved in implementing the PEPFAR program, someone who was not a fan of George W. Bush at all, which is sometimes true in the government, elements of the government. But her response to me was, this is what I always wanted to do with my life. And these programs, I think, have put USAID and the programs themselves on the front lines of just some extraordinary change. So there is a path of government. There's a path of NGO work. We have a huge debate in America about the relationship between government and faith-based and private institutions in our programs. It's not a debate internationally. Many U.S. programs are implemented, USAID programs and other programs are implemented through partners, private partners that are often faith-based partners. And that's been true forever. That's the way that business has always been done. So that is another way, to be involved in these issues. I meet extraordinary people through the Peace Corps. I wish there were more opportunities, more openings, because they have huge numbers more applicants than they can that they can fill. But the Peace Corps is a tremendous introduction to this field. It's often being thrown into the deep end in difficult circumstances. But I will make a point of meeting with Peace Corps volunteers when I'm in a variety of countries. I just did in Tanzania again. And it is a marvelous path if you can take it. And there are others like the Global Health Corps, which introduces non-doctors into efforts around the world for a year or two period. So there are a number of paths that can be taken. I would also just throw out there, because I took it, that doing policy on Capitol Hill can be very rewarding as well. To be on the policy side in health policy, when working for a member of the House or Senate, can be a tremendous experience. It certainly was for me. And then I just want to throw in that I've been talking about international issues, but doing public health in the American context is very important as well. I mean, these are, when it comes to infectious disease, when it comes to pandemic preparedness, these are some of the greatest needs that we're going to face in the future. So I'll just throw those out.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Add one thing to that real quick.
Sure.
Like mentioned, I'm Jen. I work at the One Campaign and manage our student volunteer programs. And I am a perfect example of somebody who is neither remotely an expert on political science or medicine or global health. But I kind of just got involved with this stuff in college because I was passionate about kind of making social change. Took on some leadership opportunities on my college campus in a volunteer capacity. And, I only graduated 6 years ago, and now I'm working at one doing kind of grassroots organizing, working with volunteers. And that's been a really fantastic way for me to be engaged with something I'm super passionate about, albeit not necessarily having policy expertise that someone like Michael has. So, anyways, I'll be at the table after, but would always be happy to chat with folks about that type of path as well.
And I would just add here that I worked on Capitol Hill. I worked in the White House. I know what works when it comes to lobbying and influence on Capitol Hill. And one has a marvelous kind of manner, very positive, upbeat advocacy style, and nonpartisan in its approach. And the groups that make a difference often in congressional offices are religious people. Women's groups can often make a difference. Former military can often make a difference. But one of the main groups that gets listened to by members is often students. Idealistic student activists, when they come to Washington, I just spoke to our one conference of all of our activists from across the country coming to Washington. They get welcomed on Capitol Hill and have a significant amount of influence. So I just recently saw one at work on Capitol Hill, and it was very, very positive. So.
My name is Will Sassine. I'm a political science major. One of the things I was curious about is why don't we hear more about U.S. success stories in Africa? Generally, when we talk about U.S. policy in Africa, we highlight less than successful, almost, and often failures. So why don't we hear more about, when we got it right, when things worked out?
I wish I had a great answer to that. I'll give you an interesting fact. The Pew Forum does polling in countries around the world on their views of America. Okay, how do you view American influence in the world, positively or negatively? A couple of years ago, there were a couple of African countries that had a higher view of America's role in the world than Americans do of America's role in the world. It's making a massive difference. People in Africa know PEPFAR. All of Barack Obama, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton are all very popular on the continent. It's made a real difference in our public diplomacy. But then you look at, do Americans realize that? And they really don't. They hear mainly, to be honest, if you look at the discourse in like our presidential campaigns and Rand Paul's announcement yesterday, you would think that foreign aid was thrown down a rat hole, that these things had no effect. But I would just challenge people, whenever you hear politicians criticize foreign aid, just substitute the word disease surveillance, okay? Substitute the word vaccination for children, okay? These are some great public policy successes, and Americans should actually know about them and be proud of them. They did it. So I think it's the flip side of this, however, is that there are a number of politicians who have emerged as real heroes in this space, on both sides of the aisle. People like Lindsey Graham from South Carolina, unexpectedly, has become a real advocate on these issues. Marco Rubio has become a real advocate on these issues. So in my world, I'm more on the Republican side. At the leadership level, there's a significant amount of I think, principled leadership on this set of issues. But it's tough to break through on this issue. I won't go into the whole history, but during the Cold War in Africa, much of the aid we did was not really designed to have outcomes, okay? That's a fact. It was designed to support people who were supportive of one side in the Cold War, okay? And this era of aid that began with PEPFAR and PMI and the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is another great program that does economic development, these are rigorous, outcome-based programs, essentially new generation of American aid. And that, I think, is a message that needs to get out. I mean, we have had a history where sometimes aid was wasted in our history. That's not a myth. But what we've seen in the last 10 to 12 years is really a new era of aid, now practiced and continued by two administrations, one Republican and one Democratic, and has done just remarkable things in the world.
My name is Brad Adams. I'm an MBA alum of the Marriott School. And I'm curious to know the role of business, otherwise known in some places imperialist, capitalist corporations from America, raping and plundering the riches of countries such as those in Africa, instead of making a contribution. You mentioned the role of charitable and faith-based organizations partnering with government in other places. What could be done, and what are some success stories of things that have been done by American corporations, perhaps, in some of these areas abroad?
Well, first of all, I would say that it is a fact of development that direct foreign investment and internal development, investment, essentially from savings and investment, these are sources of capital that absolutely dwarf foreign aid, okay? They are the things that have to work in order for genuine development to take place. I think the best kind of foreign aid encourages the kind of structural changes that are necessary to allow for normal, sustained economic growth over time. And that's not exploitation. That's the only way that 1 billion people have been taken out of poverty in our time in India and China. It's the ultimate model that needs to be done. So you have the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is another innovation of the last 10 years, which has these compacts, which are essentially foreign aid to encourage infrastructure and other issues, but they require countries to have certain standards on rule of law, on the women's ownership of property, on corporate law. And that's the structure you need in place for long-term economic growth, okay? And for American firms to come in and do investment. One recent example that one has been focused on has been electricity production. Okay? And that is it's one of the greatest economic needs across Africa. It's a prerequisite for development. It's not been a focus of American policy. But that is then finding a catalytic way to essentially shield investments from some risk by private companies that will come in and do energy projects that are necessary. I think that's very promising. I think that's the right way to approach this. So one has been very focused on those efforts. You look at the economic model of a company like Coca-Cola in Africa is just extraordinary. I mean, they have a distribution model. They are everywhere. And they do extraordinary things. And the Coke Foundation actually does some good work. So there are some, and Coke is a multinational corporation. It's not just an American corporation. But there are some companies that have done this well. And I think that's important to the future of Africa. But there's a significant amount of competition across the continent from the Chinese. A different model of investment, which often is building roads, building soccer stadiums, building parliament buildings, hotel complexes, in exchange for a very mercantile approach to resources. Okay, so that is a traditional model of extracting resources in exchange for various benefits. And the U.S. has just had a different model. We've had a model of private investment, and so but the level of direct foreign investment of America in Africa is still quite low. Companies are quite risk averse, and so I think some of the best efforts are encouraging investment in Africa, private investment in Africa, by trying to shield companies from some of the element of risk. And there are various funds in the U.S. government that do that.
Final questions? If not, please join me in thanking Mr. Gerson.
Thank you, sir.